that, let me begin. So, my paper is titled Plotinus and the Powers of Horror, and it is going to be about Plotinus and Julia Kristeva, a contemporary continental philosopher. So Plotinus, who is a so-called Neoplatonist, his main goal was to be the penultimate exegete of Plato. In doing so, he built an entire philosophical system of his own. And while his thought is notoriously difficult to grasp, one entry point into his system is found in his account of beauty given in Aeneid 1.6 and elsewhere, but that's the main text. So in this paper, I will lay out an interpretation of the theory of beauty espoused by Plotinus in the aforementioned Aeneid, and I will also raise an objection and respond to it. So to begin with Plotinus's account. Plotinus's approach to beauty seems to have three crucial elements to it. First, it is phenomenological in its starting point. Second, it seeks to answer why symmetry, proportion, color, etc. are so often invoked in definitions and discussions of beauty by utilizing the Platonic notion of form, eidos in the Greek. Third, Plotinus's account has a theological dimension to it in which beauty draws us closer to the one, the first principle, most commonly known as God, but we'll save that for Q&A if you want. Looking at the beginning of Aeneid 1.6, Plotinus opens his inquiry into the nature of beauty by pointing out that beauty is primarily found in that which is seen, though it is also found in objects of the intellect like sound and virtue. The seeing of things is both sense-perceptive in the case of beautiful people or nature, and intellectual in the case of virtues, for instance. After noting the relation between beauty and that which is seen, Plotinus then poses a question which he notes will be used as a stepping stone into his inquiry into the beautiful. He says, to quote, "What is it then that moves the eyes of spectators and turns them towards it, beauty, and draws them on and makes them rejoice at the sight? By finding whatever this is and using it as a stepping stone, we might also be able to see the rest," talking there about the beautiful and conditions for the possibility of beauty. As the text indicates, this question guides Plotinus's inquiry, so it's worth pausing to understand what he means. At a cursory glance, he seems to be doing two things. First, he indicates that approaching the perception or sensory experience of beauty is how one can begin to understand beauty itself. Second, and more fundamentally, beauty is grasped by a relation towards consciousness, as there is something about the experience of beauty, something in the object that we call beautiful. In understanding what it is about the object and its givenness to consciousness, we can start to understand beauty. Both of these claims, found in Plotinus's opening lines of Aeneid 1.6, indicate that inquiry into the beautiful is from the outset phenomenological. In the words of Eric Pearl, who endorses this interpretation, beauty will be approached as a feature of being in relation to awareness, not by itself in isolation from any consciousness. Prima facie, then, it looks like Plotinus's account of beauty begins with a phenomenological approach. In other words, that an analysis of beauty should start by recognizing the fact that so-called beautiful things have an immediate impact on our sense perception and cognition, and it is by this that we begin to approach the beautiful. The second major aspect of Plotinus's account of beauty is that of form, as I said, eidos in the Greek. As stated above, beauty presents itself as that which is given to awareness, and this marks the first step into the inquiry into beauty. First step in the inquiry into beauty. By looking to the conscious experience of beauty and being aware of what saturates our senses, we should be able to make more progress. That stepping stone comment that he made. But there seems to be a problem. What is given to experience is a manifold of things, such as symmetry, color, proportion. It may then seem that something like these aspects, symmetry, color, proportion, would be responsible for our experience of beauty, perhaps indicating that it is symmetry or some other property that is truly what accounts for the beautiful. Plotinus actually recognizes this and says, to quote, "It is actually said by everyone that the symmetry of parts in relation to each other and to the whole, added to fine coloration, makes something beautiful to see, end quote. In fact, it is this stoic, and yet quite modern, as we saw in the opening talks last night, conception of beauty that Plotinus seeks to criticize and build on. The friendly criticism he offers seems to be threefold. First, Plotinus points out that such a definition, symmetry, color, proportion, etc., does not account for the beauty of simple things such as God. Second, the definition does not account for the beauty of immaterial things like mathematical proofs, theorems, sounds, etc. And third, most importantly, in my opinion, the definition does not account for itself. That is, it does not explain what it is about symmetry and proportion that makes something beautiful. We should notice the broader move that Plotinus is making in the text. By critiquing such a common conception of beauty, he seems to be seeking an answer to the question of what grounds such common judgments of beauty. That is, what is it that makes symmetrical things beautiful? Why do symmetry, color, proportion at all seem to play a role in our apprehension of the beautiful? What is the condition for the very possibility of anything being beautiful at all? In a later treatise, this is explicitly stated, as Plotinus points out that his search is for that which makes symmetry and proportion conditions of the beautiful. He says that beauty, in his own words, is what illuminates symmetry rather than symmetry itself, and this, whatever it is what is lovable. Moving on then to find an explanation for why it is that we find such things as symmetry and color to be beautiful, Plotinus turns to form. It is form which, as given to consciousness, what makes things beautiful. Form, however, is a technical term, having its roots in Plato. It doesn't simply refer to the formal cause or structuring of the material components of a thing. Rather, it is one, the very condition for the intelligibility of things. It's the reality which makes things to be able to be understood. And two, it's located, to use a phrase loosely, within intellect or nous, entailing that intellect and beauty are directly connected. In short, Plotinus thinks that form as given to consciousness is what accounts for the judgments that we make about things in calling them beautiful. In other words, it is form as given to consciousness which gives rise to beauty. And since the Neoplatonist axiom that whatever is in the effect must exist more preeminently in the cause, we can say that form is supereminently beautiful. A corollary of this is that since all things that are given to consciousness have form, all things are intelligible and beautiful. Quite a striking claim. This conclusion is what forced Suzanne Stern-Gillet to conclude that Plotinus does not offer a normal aesthetics in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions for determining which things are beautiful and which are not, but rather a pancalism in which all things, because they share in form, as given to consciousness, are or participate beauty. Now turning to the third account, or the third condition of Plotinus' account. As I've stated, beauty for Plotinus is identified most eminently with form as given to consciousness. Form is what makes something beautiful, thus allowing for our experience of beauty. Even so, Plotinus' philosophical methodology indicates that explanation must end in an auto-explicable first principle, God. As such, the very existence of form and the predications we make of beautiful things must be explained by recourse to a further principle. This further principle, or first principle we should say, is the One, or God. But even such a name is inadequate to describe it. This divine principle is ultimately responsible for the very non-temporal but ontological production of forms, and thus what ultimately explains why we can experience beauty and make true predications about the beautiful. For Plotinus, recognition of this theological reality has a large payoff. Through beauty, one can ascend to the One. In a somewhat similar fashion to Aquinas' reasoning to God in the Summa, the contemplation of beauty as form and thus as intelligible leads one to seeking what is responsible for the intelligibility as such. He says, for analogies, negations, and knowledge of things derived from it teach us about the good. This is another word, name for the One. And also by certain means of ascent. As a result, Plotinus has led to saying that through beauty we approach God or the One with fear and trembling, prostrating before him. Quite a striking claim, especially for a Neoplatonist like Plotinus. The One, or God, being responsible for the production and sustaining of all forms, and thus beauty, is immanent to all things, and through contemplation all things can ascend to him. As he most beautifully states it, here the ultimate contest is set before our souls. All our toil and trouble is for this, not to be left without a share in the best of visions. The man who attains this is blessed in seeing that the blessed sight, and he who fails to attain it has failed utterly. For this blessed sight he should give up the attainment of kingship and rule over all earth and sea and sky, if only by leaving and overlooking them he can turn to the One and see. In short, I've sought to lay out Plotinus' account of beauty by highlighting three crucial moves that he makes in the text. First, he begins his approach to beauty with a phenomenological perspective. Second, he spells this out in terms of form, which seeks to explain why symmetry, color, and proportion are related to beauty. And third, since form is ultimately caused and sustained by the One, the inquiry into a deeper and deeper grasp of the beautiful is ultimately a theological one in which we move into a deeper grasp of God and our eternal destiny. I now turn to two objections to Plotinus' account. First, it just seems false to say that all things are beautiful. Can we really say with good intention that the war-torn city is beautiful? Further, it can be argued that some things are not intelligible forms as given to consciousness, but instead force one's intelligible grasp on reality to break down. In fact, one contemporary thinker, while not being aware of Plotinus, has developed both of these lines of thought. In her book, Powers of Horror, an essay on abjection, Julia Kristeva spells out an aesthetic category called the abject. Many of you are probably familiar with common categories in aesthetics, such as the sublime and the beautiful. The abject can and should, I think, be seen as a negation of these aesthetic categories. Kristeva's account of the abject is technical, and it involves a complicated schema of subject-object relations based on Jacques Lacan's quite obscure seminars. Nevertheless, it seems that the abject is roughly something perceived, and bear with me here, this is where it gets tricky. The abject is roughly something perceived that inhabits an in-between realm between ego and the perceived. In this in-between realm, the abject, the experience of the abject we see, threatens the ego with an inability to locate any signifier with which the abject can be pinned down. This results in a loss of meaning within the ego's perception and a recoiling at the perceived abject. In what seems to be the final stage of abject experience, the ego recoils at the very aspect of being itself, as the experience of the abject cancels us, paraphrasing Kristeva. Kristeva explicitly points out that the abject struggles to be defined, as it is by nature that which causes a breakdown in intelligibility and thus definition. Nonetheless, she lists various attributes by which the abject can be known, somewhat in the nature of the via negativa of scholastic theologians trying to name God. An example will help clarify the abstract nature of what has been said. The stock example that Kristeva uses is the corpse. According to Kristeva, as I encounter the corpse, I instantly recognize its position on the border of the symbolic order. Questions assault my mind. What has happened to its owner? Is it even coherent to think of the corpse as having an owner? Is this my ultimate fate? And so on. But crucially, Kristeva thinks the breakdown in the symbolic order reverberates throughout the ego and unleashes in the ego a reaction against being. I am horrified by the experience of being that I encounter when the abject assaults my senses. As Kristeva says, it is thus not lack of cleanliness or health that causes abjection, but what disturbs identity, system, order, what does not respect borders, positions, or rules. Because the experience of the abject is fundamentally the collapse of all meaning and thus intelligibility, it can, I think, be called the ultimate experience of nihilism. There is no longer any signification, no longer any coherent way to give an account of the abject and its experience. In fact, the abject, it's just simple unintelligibility. Kristeva herself strongly points to this in her text, making comments such as the abject is the revolt against being looming within. Abjection cancels our very selves, and the abject being related to the unthinkable. While it would take us too far afield into exegetical debates over Lacan and Kristeva and into debates about the nature of human development, it should also be noted that Kristeva and many thinkers in contemporary psychology, psychoanalysis, think that this experience of the abject is fundamental to human development. How exactly then does Kristeva's account oppose that of Plotinus? Well, for starters, Kristeva's account of the abject directly targets the Plotinian claim on two grounds. Plotinian claims on two grounds. First, it denies that all things are beautiful. And second, most importantly, it denies that much of reality is intelligible or structured by Plotinian form. Kristeva thinks that abject experiences force a breakdown in the symbolic order and thus lead to unintelligibility in our conception of them. If she is correct, then much of life, as the rest of her text goes on to show, is at its core an experience of the breakdown of the intelligibility of being, and therefore nihilistic. For instance, she spends a large portion of her book arguing that much of the biblical texts fall under the notion of the abject. Other instances, like loved ones' funerals, war, and much more, would be cloaked with abjection and, under her account, unintelligible. Resolving the tension, my final section. Under further inspection, I think that the tensions that Kristeva's account poses can be dissolved. My criticism is twofold. Let us first note an assumption. What I find to be the crucial assumption that Kristeva makes is in going from an experience of the so-called abjection to the further claim that the abject is not, and in principle, cannot be signified in the symbolic order. She seems to provide no defense of such an inference. Moving on to another issue in her account, it seems that to even define the abject and to go on to give an account of what it entails for human experience, Kristeva must engage in a phenomenological analysis of that which is given to consciousness, just as Plotinus does. But to even engage in this, it must be the case that such realities are intelligible, meaning they're structured by form. And this intelligibility itself is the direct product of the one. Take, for instance, her stock example of the corpse. Kristeva analyzes the phenomenological experience of what we encounter when we apprehend it. In doing this, she renders the experience intelligible, for even to conceive that the corpse is to conceive that it participates in form, which is ultimately traceable back to the one. In advancing her own account of the abject, she seems to rely on Plotinus' account to make her notion of the abject comprehensible. To put this criticism another way, if Kristeva and Plotinus were able to converse with each other, I suspect that her account would fall within the scope of Plotinus' critique of the Stoics' account of beauty as symmetry. It fails to justify its own conditions and presupposes those of Plotinus. We can see hints of my twofold criticism in Kristeva's own text, as she seems to trap herself in her own context, or in her own concepts. The abject, she claims, entails a breakdown in the symbolic order and in meaning. It would seem, though, that this would render any description of the phenomenon indescribable. Yet, as her own text showcases at length, the experience is described, thanks to the inherent form which is grasped by the intellect in the experience of the abject. In sum, Kristeva's account, I submit, goes too far. Her analysis of the experience of the abject seems in some sense to be correct. It is true that we recoil in horror at the sight of a corpse and other things. However, one, not only does she fail to justify a crucial assumption in the inference that she makes, but two, each time that such a judgment about the abject is even made, it presupposes the intelligibility of the phenomenon encountered, and in Plotinus' terms, presupposes participation in form and thus some small participation in beauty. It would be impossible for the intellect to grasp the abject in order to recoil at it if it did not participate in form as given to consciousness. Hence, I don't think that Kristeva's account of the abject poses any problem for Plotinus' theory. In fact, it seems that they can really go hand in hand with each other. To better understand all that I've said, it may be helpful to end by quoting one of Augustine's comments on beauty, since he was likely influenced by Plotinus' Aeneid. Speaking of the corruptible beauties which man in his moral failure is cast down into, Augustine says this, quote, do not be surprised if I still call them, the corruptible beauties, beautiful things. For everything is beautiful that is in due order. And as the apostle says, all order is of God. We must admit that a weeping man is better than a happy worm, and yet I could speak at great length without any falsehood in praise of the worm. What am I to say about its soul animating its tiny body? Even a worm's soul causes it to move with precision, to seek things suitable for it, and to avoid or overcome difficulties as far as possible. Augustine's point, then, is that all things, from man to the lowliest creature, share in a sense of the beautiful, and by reflecting on the goodness of God's creation, we can come to see such beauty in all things. Rather than causing a breakdown in meaning, all things reflect the glory of God in his ordering or form. In sum, I have sought to explicate an account of Plotinus' theory of beauty by reading Aeneid 1.6 in terms of a phenomenal givenness to awareness, form as going beyond symmetry and color and proportion, and a theological dimension. In doing this, an objection from contemporary continental philosophy was raised. I then responded to this objection by pointing out an unjustified assumption and also attempting to show how it actually presupposes Plotinus' own position, thus failing to be an objection at all. One may not agree with Plotinus and may even find his account strange. Nevertheless, it seems that he raises novel thoughts and problems that are directly relevant to our discussions today. But in my opinion, Plotinus' account, as Eric Pearl aptly says, gives a metaphysical foundation for Dostoevsky's claim that beauty will save the world. That's it.